December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. A makeshift stage built from ammunition crates and cargo pallets sits in a frozen clearing behind the American lines. Snow is falling. The temperature is well below freezing. Artillery rumbles in the distance, close enough that the men watching can feel it in their boots. There are roughly 400 soldiers sitting on the frozen ground, standing against tree trunks, crouching on jeep hoods. They have not slept properly in days. Some of them will be dead within the week. And standing on that ammunition crate stage, under a grey December sky, a woman is singing. She is singing in German. The men in front of her have been fighting through the worst winter Europe has seen in decades. The ground is frozen so hard that foxholes have to be blasted out with explosives. Frostbite casualties are running almost as high as combat casualties. Some of these soldiers have not been out of their boots in a week. Their hands are cracked and raw. Their uniforms are stiff with dried mud and ice. A few of them are crying. The song is called Lili Marlene. Every soldier in the audience knows it. Every German soldier in the forest a few kilometers away knows it too. It is the most famous song of the entire war, beloved by both sides, hummed in foxholes from North Africa to Normandy, by men who were trying to kill each other the next morning. The woman singing it is Marlene Dietrich. She was born in Berlin. She is the most famous actress the German film industry ever produced. The Nazi government once personally asked her to come home and be the crown jewel of the Reich's cultural machine. She refused. She became an American citizen, and now she is here, in the Ardennes, in artillery range, singing a German love song to American infantrymen who are fighting her homeland. She is not wearing a sequined gown. She is wearing olive drab. She has developed frostbite in her hands from weeks of performing in the open air. She has been sleeping in tents, eating field rations, and sharing quarters with combat nurses. When someone asked her later why she did it, why she kept going forward into danger when she could have stayed in Hollywood and made films, her answer was two words in the language she had been born into. She said, aus Anstand, out of decency. That phrase, aus Anstand, is where this investigation begins, because the question it answers is the question the German officer corps could not stop asking when they learned what the Americans were doing, not just with Dietrich, with hundreds of famous entertainers, with thousands of performers, with an entire national infrastructure built to do something the Wehrmacht had no doctrinal category for. The Americans were sending their most valuable civilian faces, their film stars, their comedians, their musicians, their heavyweight boxing champion, into combat zones. Not to fight, not to spy, not to deliver propaganda speeches about the glory of the Republic. They were sending them to tell jokes, to sing love songs, to remind exhausted infantrymen of the country they had left behind and the life that was waiting for them if they survived. The German military system looked at this and saw weakness. It saw decadence. It saw a soft nation that could not ask its soldiers to simply do their duty without bribing them with Hollywood glamour. That assessment was wrong. It was catastrophically wrong. And the reason it was wrong is the reason this story matters. Because the American decision to fly its celebrities into artillery range was not a morale gimmick. It was the visible surface of a completely different understanding of what a soldier is and what an army owes the men who fight for it. An understanding the German system had rejected so thoroughly that by the winter of 1944 it could not even recognize what it was looking at. To understand why Marlene Dietrich was standing on an ammunition crate in the Ardennes, and why German officers found it incomprehensible, we need to go back 3 years to a decision made in Washington that would quietly reshape how the largest army in American history thought about the men inside it. February 4, 1941. 10 months before Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt asks 6 civilian organizations, the Young Men's Christian Association, the Young Women's Christian Association, the National Catholic Community Service, the National Jewish Welfare Board, the Travelers' Aid Association, and the Salvation Army, to combine their resources into a single body that would support the millions of young Americans about to be called into military service. The organization they created was called the United Service Organizations, the USO. The USO's original mission was straightforward: build recreation centers near military bases, give soldiers a place to relax, write letters, drink coffee, and feel, for an hour or two, like civilians again. But within months the mission expanded into something nobody had originally planned. In October of 1941, 2 months before the United States entered the war, the USO spun off a dedicated entertainment division called USO Camp Shows Incorporated. It was headed by Abe Lastfogel, the chairman of the William Morris Talent Agency, a man who knew every major name in American show business and who now had a single job: get them to the troops. The first overseas tour went out weeks later, in November of 1941. Laurel and Hardy, Chico Marx, and dancer Mitzi Mayfair flew to military bases in the Caribbean. It was a small beginning. Within 3 years, it would become the largest entertainment operation in human history. By the war's end, USO Camp Shows had staged 428,521 performances across roughly 208,000 locations worldwide. More than 7,000 entertainers had traveled overseas. More than 130 million individual troop attendees had watched a USO show. At the peak of operations, the USO was producing roughly 700 shows per day across every theater of the war. The shows were organized into 4 circuits. The Victory Circuit handled large stateside productions with major headliners. The Blue Circuit sent smaller vaudeville acts and comedians to domestic bases. The Hospital Circuit performed for wounded men in military hospitals, and the Foxhole Circuit, the one that matters most to this story, went as close to the front lines as the Army would permit. Foxhole Circuit performers were told plainly when they signed up that they were entering a war zone. They signed an oath of secrecy. They were issued dog tags. They were informed, in language the USO's own guides did not soften, that they were now subject to military authority and military risk. The conditions on the Foxhole Circuit were nothing like Hollywood. Performers traveled in military transport, often in the back of open trucks on rutted roads. They slept in tents, in bombed-out buildings, in whatever shelter was available. They performed on stages made of anything the local troops could find: flatbed trucks and stacked ammunition crates, cleared patches of ground in an orchard or a village square. The audience sat on helmets, on the ground, on the hoods of jeeps, on anything flat. There was no lighting except what could be rigged from vehicle headlamps. There were no dressing rooms. Performers changed behind a blanket hung from a tree branch. Sound systems, when they existed, were borrowed from military public address equipment. When they did not exist, the performers simply projected their voices across a field and hoped the wind was not blowing the wrong way. A typical Foxhole Circuit troupe was small, usually 6 or 7 performers who traveled together for weeks at a time. They might do 3 or 4 shows a day, moving from one unit to another, performing for audiences of 50 or 400, arriving unannounced because troop locations could not be publicized, and leaving before dark because the roads near the front were dangerous after sunset. The performers ate what the troops ate. They drank what the troops drank. They endured what the troops endured, except that when the show was over, the troops stayed in their foxholes, and the performers moved on to the next unit and did it again. 37 USO Camp Show members were killed in the line of duty during the Second World War. Remember that number. 37 civilians, most of them entertainers, who died not because they were soldiers, but because they had volunteered to stand on a stage within range of enemy fire and make other people's soldiers laugh. The reason this happened, the reason the United States built this machine, was not because Americans loved show business more than Germans did. Germany had theaters. Germany had film studios. Germany had orchestras and opera houses, and one of the richest cultural traditions in Europe. The reason was something deeper. It was a difference in how the two nations answered a single question: what is a soldier? The American answer had been articulated most clearly by the man who was building the American army from scratch. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, believed that the American army had to be, in his view, an army of citizen soldiers and essentially a democratic institution. He argued that this new army could not be disciplined by fear and intimidation, but only through respect. He insisted that commanders personally attend to their troops' physical needs, recreation facilities, and mental and morale activities. In his final report after the war, Marshall described the citizen soldier as the guarantee against the misuse of military power. Read that philosophy carefully. The soldier is not a servant of the state. The soldier is a citizen in uniform. He has been temporarily removed from civilian life. He will return to civilian life. And while he is in uniform, the nation owes him not just equipment and leadership, but care, emotional care, psychological care, a connection to the home he left behind, and the life he is fighting to get back to. This was not sentimentality. Marshall backed it with science. He commissioned a sociologist named Samuel Stouffer to lead the research branch of the Army's Information and Education Division. Stouffer's team began surveying troops the day after Pearl Harbor. Over the course of the war, using more than 200 questionnaires, they interviewed more than 500,000 soldiers. They ran controlled experiments on everything, from training films to mail delivery schedules. They published a monthly digest called What the Soldier Thinks, and after the war, produced a landmark 4-volume study called The American Soldier. What Stouffer's researchers found confirmed what Marshall had intuited. Soldiers did not fight for ideology. They did not fight because they hated the enemy. They did not fight for democracy or freedom or any of the words the propaganda posters used. They fought for each other. They fought so they would not let their buddies down. The single most important factor in combat motivation was the bond between the individual soldier and the small group of men around him. And here is the connection to what Dietrich was doing in that frozen clearing in the Ardennes. Entertainment was not a distraction from the war. It was part of the system that kept the bonds intact. When a comedian stood on a stage in a muddy field in France and made 400 exhausted infantrymen laugh at the same joke at the same time, he was doing something that no amount of training or equipment could replicate. He was reminding those men that they were still part of something larger than the foxhole. He was giving them a shared experience that was not about death. He was, for 20 minutes, making them feel like the civilians they had been before the war and would be again after it. The entertainment was one piece of a vast morale infrastructure the American military built during the war. V-mail gave soldiers a fast, reliable way to send letters home. The system worked by photographing each letter onto microfilm, shipping the film overseas, and printing the letters at the destination. It saved enormous amounts of cargo space. A single mailbag of microfilm could carry the equivalent of 37 mail sacks of paper letters, and it gave soldiers the one thing they wanted more than anything except going home: contact with the people they loved. At its peak, the V-mail system was processing more than 1 million letters a week. The Armed Forces Radio Service broadcast programs like Command Performance and Mail Call to bases worldwide. Command Performance was unique in American broadcasting. It was produced at the direct request of servicemen, who wrote in asking to hear specific performers or specific songs. The biggest stars in America, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, appeared on the show for free, performing whatever the troops asked for. The message was built into the format. You asked, we listened. Here is exactly what you wanted. The Stars and Stripes newspaper gave troops their own independent press, written by and for enlisted men, with editorial freedom that sometimes embarrassed the brass. Yank magazine reportedly reached a peak circulation of more than 2 million. First-run Hollywood films were shown in camp theaters, sometimes within weeks of their domestic release, and the Army Motion Picture Service shipped thousands of film prints to projection units in combat zones worldwide. And the American Red Cross Clubmobile program sent convoys of converted Green Line buses and GMC trucks to forward areas, staffed by college-educated women between the ages of 25 and 35, all of them required to be single. They served coffee and donuts, but the donuts were almost beside the point. What the Clubmobile women provided was conversation, an American woman's voice, a reminder that the world the soldiers had left behind still existed and still had people in it who cared enough to drive a truck through a war zone to bring them something warm to drink. The first large-scale Clubmobile deployment in Europe came at Normandy in June of 1944, just days after the invasion. 86 Red Cross workers, 52 of them women, died during the Second World War. Every piece of this system delivered the same message: you matter, not as a unit of combat power, not as a cog in the war machine. You, the individual soldier, The man from Iowa or Brooklyn or a small town in Alabama, you matter. We have not forgotten you. The country you left behind has not moved on without you. Here is a letter from your mother. Here is a song you danced to with your girl before you shipped out. Here is a comedian who was on the radio last month in your living room and is now standing in the mud 30 miles from the German lines, telling you the same jokes he told America, because you are still part of America even here. That was the message, and the German military system had no way to hear it. Now I want to take you into the lives of the people who delivered that message, because the scale of what they risked has never been fully understood. And the best place to start is the woman who embodied the entire paradox of the American morale machine, a German-born star who turned her back on the country that made her famous and walked into the war to fight it with a microphone instead of a rifle. Marlene Dietrich had been one of the biggest film stars in the world since 1930, when The Blue Angel made her an international sensation and earned her a contract with Paramount Pictures. By the late 1930s, she was living in Hollywood, rich and famous, with no military obligation of any kind. When Nazi representatives approached her in 1937, reportedly at Adolf Hitler's personal request, and asked her to return to Germany as the jewel of the Reich's film industry, she did not hesitate. She refused. In 1939, she became an American citizen. She never looked back. From January 1942 through September 1943, Dietrich crisscrossed the United States selling war bonds. She appeared before 250,000 troops on the Pacific coast leg alone. She was reported to have raised more money through bond sales than any other celebrity in the country. But selling bonds was not enough for her. She wanted to go to the front. She made 2 extended USO tours, the first in 1944 and the second lasting 11 months into 1945. She performed for Allied troops in Algeria, Italy, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Her act included songs from her films, a comedy routine on the musical Saw, an instrument she had learned in 1920s Berlin, and a mind-reading act that Orson Welles had taught her for his Mercury Wonder Show. According to the Library of Congress, she was the first entertainer to reach rescued Allied soldiers at Anzio, one of the most dangerous beachheads of the Italian campaign. She slept in tents and field hospitals. She caught influenza and performed through it. She developed frostbite that winter and kept performing. Her fellow entertainers joked that she was always trying to get them killed. The filmmaker Billy Wilder is said to have remarked that Dietrich had spent more time at the front lines than Eisenhower. But there was another dimension to Dietrich's war that the public did not know about until decades later. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would later become the CIA, recruited her for its morale operations branch. The OSS was running a program of musical propaganda designed to demoralize German troops, and Dietrich, the only performer who knew her recordings were being used for intelligence purposes, recorded songs in German for broadcast behind enemy lines. Among them was Lili Marlene, the song German soldiers loved, sung by the most famous German woman alive, turned into a weapon against the country of her birth. OSS Chief Major General William Donovan personally wrote to her afterward. He told her he was deeply grateful for her generosity in making those recordings. American strategic assessments reportedly concluded that the broadcasts were as damaging to German morale as an air raid. According to biographical accounts, Dietrich was performing in or near the Bastogne area when the German Ardennes offensive erupted on December 16, 1944. She came under what the Germans call Feindberührung, enemy contact, and narrowly escaped capture. A Berlin-born woman singing her birth country's most beloved soldier's song in a forest full of German troops who were trying to kill the men she was singing for. The irony was total, and it was an irony the German command structure could not process. By the end of the war, Dietrich had given more than 500 performances for Allied troops. She received the Medal of Freedom, which she called her proudest accomplishment. France awarded her the Legion of Honor. Belgium awarded her the Order of Leopold. She had risked her life for years in conditions that would have broken most soldiers, and she had done it as a civilian volunteer with no obligation except the one she described in 2 German words, aus Anstand, out of decency. Dietrich was the most dramatic example, but she was not alone. The list of American entertainers who put themselves in genuine danger during the war is longer than most people realize, and some of them paid for it with their lives. Bob Hope played his first show for troops at Marchfield, California, on May 6, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. What started as a single appearance became a calling that would define the rest of his life. Hope understood something instinctive about performing for soldiers that most entertainers had to learn. He understood that what the men needed was not a polished Hollywood production. They needed someone who talked to them the way they talked to each other. His humor was fast, topical, and built almost entirely around the shared miseries of military life: the food, the weather, the officers, the boredom, the homesickness. He made fun of generals to their faces in front of their own troops, and the generals laughed because they understood what Hope was doing. He was telling the enlisted men that someone from the outside world saw their lives clearly and found them worth joking about. That recognition, that visibility, was the gift. By 1943, he was overseas. His tour that year took him through England, North Africa, Sicily, and Ireland. In Palermo, German bombers hit the harbor area around the hotel where his troupe was staying. The shockwaves rattled the building. Hope kept performing the next day as if nothing had happened. His 1944 Pacific tour covered thousands of miles and dozens of shows across the South Pacific and the Western Pacific. He traveled with singer Frances Langford, dancer Patty Thomas, guitarist Tony Romano, and comedian Jerry Colonna. Langford, who had one of the most recognizable voices in American popular music, would later say that the hardest part of performing for troops was not the danger, it was watching their faces when she sang a love song. The men in the audience would go completely still. Some of them would turn away so the men next to them would not see their eyes. She was singing the songs they had danced to with their wives and sweethearts before the war, and for 3 minutes those men were not in a combat zone. They were home. And then the song ended and they were back. The novelist John Steinbeck, then working as a war correspondent, wrote that when the time for recognition of service to the nation in wartime comes to be considered, Bob Hope should be high on the list. He wrote that Hope drove himself and was driven by something beyond the demands of his profession. Martha Raye, the actress and comedian, went overseas in late October 1942 as part of a 4-woman troupe that also included Kay Francis, Carol Landis, and Mitzi Mayfair. They toured England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and North Africa. The tour was later immortalized in a 1944 film called 4 Jills in a Jeep. What the film did not capture was the reality. In North Africa, Raye fell seriously ill and lost 22 pounds. According to her biographer, she spent 3 days in a trench under German bombing. She assisted in field hospitals between performances, treating wounded soldiers with the same hands she used to tell jokes an hour later. The troops in the remote areas where she insisted on performing gave her a nickname. They called her Colonel Maggie. She became the first civilian woman buried with full military honors at Fort Bragg when she died in 1994. The heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Joe Louis, enlisted in the United States Army in 1942. He was the most famous athlete in America and one of the most recognized men on earth. He could have served in a comfortable stateside post. Instead, he asked to be sent overseas. He staged roughly 96 boxing exhibitions and traveled more than 21,000 miles, entertaining servicemen in England, Italy, and North Africa. At every base he visited, he sparred with local soldiers, shook every hand that was offered, and sat with enlisted men in their mess halls. He did not perform for officers' clubs. He performed for the men. 5 days before D-Day, he performed at Bushy Park, near the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, in front of soldiers who would be landing on the beaches of Normandy within the week. His Legion of Merit citation, awarded in September 1945, stated that Staff Sergeant Barrow had entertained 2 million soldiers by frequent boxing exhibitions, which entailed considerable risk to his boxing future, but that he had willingly volunteered such action rather than disappoint the soldiers. And then there were the ones who did not come back. On February 22, 1943, a Pan American Airways flying boat called the Yankee Clipper, on a regular commercial route from New York to Lisbon, crashed into the Tagus River in Portugal. Aboard were 7 USO performers headed overseas to entertain troops. 24 of the 39 people on the aircraft were killed. Among the dead was singer Tamara Dracine, who had taken the seat originally assigned to another performer, Jane Froman. Froman survived but was gravely injured. She endured dozens of surgeries over the following years, and then, on crutches, she went back. In 1945, she gave 95 shows for troops in Europe, performing on a stage she could barely stand on because the war was not over and the men still needed someone to sing for them. On December 15, 1944, exactly 1 day before the German Ardennes offensive began, a single-engine Norseman aircraft carrying Major Glenn Miller disappeared over the English Channel. Miller had given up one of the most successful music careers in America to lead the Army Air Forces Band at General Eisenhower's personal request. At the age of 38, already wealthy, already famous, already past the age when anyone would have expected him to serve, he had volunteered. He told friends that he felt he had an obligation. The men fighting the war deserved real music, not recordings, not radio broadcasts from the other side of an ocean, but a live orchestra playing the songs they loved, in a hall close enough to the front that they could forget where they were for an hour. He was flying to Paris to arrange performances for troops who would soon be fighting the largest German offensive on the Western Front. His remains were never found. Archival research has since attributed the crash to mechanical failure, most likely carburetor icing in the severe winter conditions. He was 40 years old. He died doing what the German military system considered unnecessary. He died trying to bring music to soldiers. These are the names that most people know, but the overwhelming majority of the 7,000 entertainers who went overseas were not famous. They were small-time vaudeville acts, local comedians, musicians from regional dance bands, acrobats, magicians, and singers whose names never appeared in any newspaper. They went because the USO asked them to go, and they performed in places that would never be written about in any history book. They performed on flatbed trucks in the rain outside field hospitals. They sang in bombed-out churches and village squares where artillery could be heard in the next valley. They did multiple shows a day, moving from one unit to another along muddy roads, arriving without advance notice because troop locations could not be publicized. Their audiences were men who had not slept in days, men who were going back to the line in the morning, men who were never going back to anything. The unknown performers of the USO did not expect recognition. Most of them never received any. Their names are in administrative records that nobody reads, filed in archives that nobody visits, attached to shows that nobody remembers, except the men who watched them. 98% of USO performers were unknown. They are the ones who made the machine work. They are the 37 who died. Every like on this video helps the stories of people like these reach the audience they deserve. It is a small thing, but it keeps visible the names that history has quietly set aside. And those names deserve better than silence. Now here is where the story turns. Because if you are a German officer in 1944, looking at the American morale machine from the outside, you are not seeing what I have just described. You are not seeing a sophisticated system built on a specific understanding of the individual soldier's emotional needs. You are seeing something that looks to you like indulgence, like softness, like proof that the Americans are exactly what your propaganda has always said they were, a nation of materialists who cannot endure hardship without being bribed. And the reason you are seeing it that way is that your own nation built a completely different system for a completely different purpose, and you have no frame of reference for the American one. Germany was not without its own troop entertainment. The Nazi government had established a leisure organization called Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, in November 1933, under Robert Lay's German Labour Front. Its cultural apparatus eventually expanded into dedicated troop care units, known as Truppenbetreuung. After the invasion of Poland, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda created its own department for caring for the troops, with Goebbels appointing a man named Hans Hinkel to run it. They hired civilian performers and sent them to occupation zones and rear areas across Europe. Portable stages were set up in cities from Bordeaux and Paris to Tobruk, Naples, Kursk, and Krasnodar. More than 1,000 artists participated. Combat troops were also brought to cultural venues as guests of the Führer. Some attended performances at the Bayreuth Festival. Robert Ley, in a propaganda statement published in the Nazi newspaper Der Angriff on July 21, 1944, claimed roughly 836,000 events during the war, with a combined 275 million soldier attendances. Historians have cautioned that these figures were almost certainly embellished, but even a conservative estimate suggests a substantial operation. So Germany had entertainment, Germany had performers, Germany had stages and audiences and events. The question is not whether the Germans entertained their troops, the question is why. And the answer to that question is where the two systems diverge so completely that they become unrecognizable to each other. The American system was built on welfare. Its purpose was to serve the soldier. The German system was built on propaganda. Its purpose was to use the soldier. This is not an interpretation. It is documented in the German military's own records. When the war broke out in September 1939, the Wehrmacht initially rejected troop entertainment entirely. An official response to the propaganda ministry's offer of cultural support stated plainly that the army was at present uninterested in artistic performances for the troops, and that in the eastern operational area, a deployment of soldier stages was currently out of the question under any circumstances. The German military command saw entertainment as superfluous, a distraction. Soldiers had a duty to fulfill. They did not need comedians. When the Wehrmacht reversed course and accepted cultural support, it did so on terms that would have been alien to the American system. Official guidance from the German High Command framed troop care events as serving the strengthening of inner forces, meaning combat capacity and ideological conviction, not the emotional well-being of the individual soldier. Historian Frank Vossler titled his definitive study of the program Propaganda in die eigene Truppe, which translates to propaganda into one's own troops. He emphasized what he called the functional and manipulative character of Wehrmacht cultural care. The purpose was not to make the soldier feel valued. The purpose was to make the soldier fight harder. Hans Hinkel, the man Goebbels put in charge of the program, described his entertainment units in official communications as equally essential as the Wehrmacht itself, claiming that soldiers and artists shared a bond through their mutual allegiance to Hitler. Hitler himself told gathered artists that they must take on the proudest defense of the German people through German art. Art was not a gift to the soldier, art was a tool of the state. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad in early 1943, the ideological loading of German troop entertainment intensified. The concept of culture was weaponized ever more explicitly to convince soldiers of the necessity of defending German civilization against what the regime called barbarism from the East. Entertainment was no longer even pretending to be about the soldier's happiness. It was about convincing him that his suffering had meaning, that his sacrifice was demanded by history, and that the only acceptable response to material inferiority was more will. This is where the defining slogan appears. The late war doctrine of Wehrmacht ideological indoctrination was built around a single phrase: Wille und Geist besiegen Material und Masse. Will and spirit conquer material and mass. Where the American system answered material and emotional need with material abundance, the German system answered material inferiority by demanding more willpower. Where the American private in the Ardennes got Bob Hope and a hot meal and a letter from his mother, the German private in the Ardennes got a lecture on duty and a reminder that the Führer expected him to hold his position until death. By 1944, the German system was actively dismantling even the entertainment it had. From 1942 onward, the Wehrmacht progressively replaced Betreuung, meaning care, with a concept called Wehrgeistige Führung, ideological leadership. The culmination came with the creation of the National Socialist Leadership Officers, ordered by Hitler's directive in December of 1943, and deployed across the army from 1944 onward, political commissars embedded in military units, whose job was not to boost morale, but to enforce ideological compliance. And then, in late August of 1944, with the declaration of total war, The German government ordered the shutdown of nearly all remaining theatres, orchestras, and cultural troop care operations across the Reich, effective September of that year. Only hospital performances were spared. The message was unmistakable. Entertainment is a luxury. Duty is not. There is one more piece of the German story that needs to be told here, because it captures the ideological contradiction at the heart of the entire system. The song Lili Marlene. Lili Marlene began as a poem written in 1915 by a Hamburg-born schoolteacher named Hans Leip, who had been conscripted into the German army during the First World War. Leip was standing guard outside a barracks in Berlin before being shipped to the Russian front. A young woman named Lili walked past on her way home. Another woman he knew, named Marlene, was on his mind. He combined them into a single figure, a girl standing under a lantern outside the barracks gate, waiting for a soldier who might never come back. The poem sat unpublished for more than 2 decades before composer Norbert Schulze set it to music in 1938. Singer Lali Anderson recorded it on August 2, 1939. It initially sold only about 700 copies. Nobody cared. Then, after the German occupation of Yugoslavia, the German military radio station Soldatensender Belgrade began broadcasting the song on August 18, 1941. The station's evening sign-off program played it every night at approximately 9:55, just before the 10 o'clock close. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Afrika Korps in North Africa, reportedly requested that it be played regularly. Within weeks, something extraordinary happened. British soldiers of the 8th Army, fighting Rommel across the North African desert, began tuning in to the same German broadcast. They could not understand the words, but they did not need to. The melody carried everything. A soldier standing guard in the dark, a woman waiting under a lamp, the ache of separation, the uncertainty of return. It was the universal experience of every man in uniform on either side of the wire. Both armies hummed the same melody in their foxholes. Both armies listened to the same broadcast at the same time every night. For 3 minutes, the war did not exist. There was only a lantern, a girl, and the wish to go home. Here is the part that reveals everything. Joseph Goebbels hated the song. He considered it defeatist, too sentimental, too focused on longing and loss rather than duty and victory. He ordered it off the air. Lali Anderson herself was banned from performing for 9 months because of her contacts with Jewish friends in Switzerland. She reportedly attempted suicide during the ban. The regime that had created the most popular piece of troop entertainment in the entire war tried to destroy it because it served the soldiers' emotional needs rather than the state's ideological requirements. And then Marlene Dietrich took that same song and sang it for American soldiers and recorded it for the OSS to broadcast behind German lines. The cultural inversion was total. The German soldier's own love song, banned by his own government, was now being used against him by a woman his own country had tried to recruit and failed to keep. The American system had taken something the German system had rejected and turned it into a weapon, not a weapon of ideology, a weapon of feeling. Now I need to be honest with you about something, because accuracy matters more than a good story. The question at the center of this investigation is whether German officers were genuinely baffled by the American entertainment system. The dramatic version of this story would have a German general at a bugged table in an English country house expressing amazement at the USO. The historical record does not quite give us that. Between 1942 and 1945, British intelligence, under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Kendrick, secretly recorded conversations between captured senior German officers held at a converted manor house in North London called Trent Park. The Germans believed it was simply a comfortable prisoner of war camp. The food was good. They were given chess sets and books and access to the gardens. Some were taken on supervised trips to London department stores and the Savoy Hotel. Whiskey was provided. The accommodations were deliberately luxurious, not out of kindness, but because comfortable men talk more freely than uncomfortable ones. What the generals did not know was that every room, including the bedrooms and the lavatories, was wired for sound. German Jewish refugees, who had fled the Nazi regime and were now serving in British intelligence, sat in a basement beneath the house, wearing headphones, transcribing every word the generals said to each other, day and night for years. The operation was one of the most successful intelligence programs of the entire war. Dozens of generals and numerous staff officers passed through Trent Park, including Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, Ludwig Cruel, and Hans Kramer. The transcripts were classified for decades and were not rediscovered until 2001, when historian Sonke Neitzel found them in the National Archives. He published them in collaboration with social psychologist Harold Welzer, producing works that transformed historians' understanding of what German officers actually thought during the war, as opposed to what they later claimed in their carefully edited post-war memoirs. The corpus of recordings is enormous. The generals discussed strategy, their opinions of Hitler, the July 1944 assassination plot, and, in some of the most disturbing passages, war crimes they had witnessed or participated in. They spoke with a candor that was possible only because they believed no one was listening. What the published transcripts do not contain, as far as historians have been able to verify, is a named German general explicitly expressing astonishment at American troop entertainment. What they do contain is documented bewilderment at the broader Allied world, a world of abundance, humanity, and resources that the German system could not match and could not explain within its own framework. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma was recorded reflecting on why the British, unlike the Germans, treated their prisoners with such decency. General Hans Kramer, the last commander of the Afrika Corps, was deliberately driven across southern England before his repatriation, so he would witness the overwhelming Allied material buildup that was about to crash into Normandy. He could not believe what he saw. The bafflement at the American system is most vividly documented not in the general's transcripts, but in the testimony of ordinary German prisoners of war held in American camps. A German prisoner named Gunther Grave, held at Fort Lewis, Washington, in 1944, wrote decades later about a moment that had stayed with him for the rest of his life. He recalled standing in front of a shop in the prisoner of war camp and trying to decide what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. He decided to take both, and in that moment, he wrote, he suddenly realized how extremely lucky he had been to be captured by the American army and not by the Russian one. He noted that German prisoners received sufficient food and 80 cents a day, enough to buy cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, and Coca-Cola, things his mother and sister back in Germany could only dream of. Grave returned to the site of his imprisonment, by then called Joint Base Lewis McChord, on October 3, 2017. He was 91 years old. He came back not as a former prisoner, but as a grateful visitor. He had never forgotten the ice cream. That testimony is more devastating than any general's quote could be, because what Grove was describing, without knowing it, was the cultural gap this entire investigation is about. A German soldier's mother could not get ice cream. An American army was giving it to German prisoners. The nation that was sending Bob Hope and Marlene Dietrich into combat zones to entertain its own troops was simultaneously giving ice cream to the men who had been trying to kill those troops a week earlier. The German system had no category for this. It was not generosity in the German military sense. It was not strategy in the German military sense. It was something else entirely. Neitzel and Welzer, analyzing the full body of German soldier testimony, found that ordinary German troops were motivated less by Nazi ideology than by what the authors called a military frame of reference, a set of values centered on duty, obedience, and competent soldiering. Those values, the authors concluded, were far more important than ideology for soldiers' perceptions and interpretations of the war. This finding mirrors the American research. Stouffer's team found that American soldiers fought for their buddies, not for abstract ideals. German soldiers fought out of professional duty, not for the Führer. The parallel is striking. Both armies were powered by the same fundamental human engine, loyalty to the men beside you, and pride in doing your job well. Both sets of researchers arrived at essentially the same conclusion from opposite sides of the war. The difference was not in what drove the soldiers. The difference was in what the two systems did with that knowledge. The American system took the finding and built on it. If soldiers fight for each other, Then strengthen the bonds between them. Give them shared experiences that are not about death. Give them entertainment, letters from home, a newspaper that treats them as citizens, a radio program that plays the songs they asked for. Keep the human connections alive so the combat connections hold. The German system took the same underlying reality and ignored it. If soldiers fight out of duty, then demand more duty. If willpower matters, then demand more willpower. If the bonds between soldiers hold under pressure, then increase the pressure and see how long the bonds last without any support from above. The German system did not deny that its soldiers had emotional needs. It simply declared those needs to be irrelevant to the mission. But here is the critical difference. The American system recognized what its soldiers actually needed and built an infrastructure to provide it. The German system recognized what its soldiers actually needed and told them they should not need it. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theater, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit did they serve in? Where were they stationed? What did they remember? Those details matter more than anything in an official archive. They are the real record of what happened, and they deserve to be kept alive by the families who carry them. So here is the answer to the question this investigation has been asking. Why could German officers not understand why the Americans sent their film stars to the front? It was not because the Germans were stupid. They were not. The German officer corps was one of the most professionally educated military establishments in the history of warfare. It was not because the Germans lacked culture. Germany's cultural heritage was among the richest in Europe. It was not because the Germans did not care about their soldiers. Many German officers cared deeply about the men under their command. It was because the German system was built on a premise that made the American system invisible. The German premise was that the soldier exists to serve the state. His duty is to fight. His reward is the knowledge that he has done his duty. His morale comes from within, from will, from discipline, from the understanding that he is part of something greater than himself. If he needs more than that, he is weak, and weakness is not something you accommodate, it is something you overcome. The American premise was the opposite. The soldier is a citizen. He has been borrowed from civilian life. He is owed something in return. His morale is not a personal weakness to be overcome. It is a strategic resource to be cultivated. And one of the most effective ways to cultivate it is to remind him, through every means available, that the country he is fighting for has not forgotten him. When Marlene Dietrich stood on that ammunition crate stage in the Ardennes and sang Lili Marlene to 400 men who might die the next morning, she was not indulging them. She was telling them something the German system had stopped telling its own soldiers. She was telling them that they were worth the risk, that a woman had crossed an ocean and walked into a war zone, not because she was ordered to, not because she was paid to, but because she believed the men in front of her deserved it, because they were citizens, because they had names and homes and mothers and girls they had danced with before the war, because they mattered. The German private in the forest a few kilometers away had no Marlene Dietrich. He had no Bob Hope. He had no Glenn Miller, because Glenn Miller was already dead, lost over the English Channel 6 days before the offensive began, on his way to do for other soldiers what no one was coming to do for the German private. What the German private had was a slogan: will and spirit conquer material and mass. He was supposed to replace entertainment with willpower. He was supposed to replace connection with duty. He was supposed to fight without the thing the Americans had decided was worth sending their most famous citizens to die for. And here is the fact that should stay with you. The American system was not perfect. It carried within it a contradiction that a German propagandist could have exploited, and sometimes did. At Camp Robinson, Arkansas, the singer Lena Horne arrived to perform for black American soldiers and discovered that German prisoners of war had been seated in front of the black troops. The enemy was given better seats than the men who were fighting for the country Horne was supposed to represent. She walked off the stage. She went to the back of the hall, and she sang directly to the black soldiers, with the German prisoners behind her. She quit the official USO tour in protest afterward, refusing to accept segregated arrangements. She financed her own camp visits from that point on. That story matters because it shows that the American morale system was not a fairy tale. It was a real system built by a real country with real failures. But even in its failure, it revealed the principle underneath. Horn did not stop performing. She stopped performing for a system that was betraying its own premise. She kept singing for the soldiers. Because the soldiers deserved it. The German system had no Lena Horn either. Not because Germany lacked brave women, but because the German system had no space for a performer who would defy the state in order to serve the troops. In the German framework, the state and the troops were the same thing. In the American framework, they were not. The troops came first. That was the difference the German officers could not see. The names in this story are real. Marlene Dietrich was real. Bob Hope was real. Martha Raye was real. Joe Louis was real. Glenn Miller was real. Jane Froman was real. Tamara Dressen, who died in the Yankee Clipper crash on a seat that was not supposed to be hers, was real. Lena Horn was real. Gunter Groh, who stood in a prisoner of war camp in Washington state, trying to choose between ice cream and Coca-Cola, while his mother back in Germany had neither, was real. Abe Lastfogel, the talent agent who built the largest entertainment operation in history because his president asked him to, was real. The 37 USO performers who died in the line of duty were real. Their names are in the records. Most of them are not famous. Most of them never will be. And Lili Marlene was real. A love song written by a homesick German soldier in 1915, banned by the government he fought for, adopted by the enemies he fought against, and sung back to his countrymen's sons by a woman from Berlin who had chosen the other side. Not out of hatred, not out of ideology, out of decency. The German officer corps looked at all of this and saw weakness. They saw a nation that could not harden its soldiers, that needed to bribe them with laughter, that wasted resources on frivolity, when those resources could have been spent on ammunition. They were wrong. What they were looking at was not weakness. It was the visible surface of a system that understood something the German system had forgotten. An army is not a machine. It is made of people. And people do not fight well when they are treated as parts of a machine. They fight well when they are treated as if they matter. The Germans had a phrase for what they thought they were watching. They called the Americans weich, soft. It was the same word they used for nations they considered too comfortable, too prosperous, too attached to peacetime luxuries to endure the hardness of war. And in the early years, at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, and in the first weeks of the Italian campaign, there were moments when the accusation seemed justified. The Americans had not yet learned how to fight, but the system behind them, the system that sent Bob Hope into a harbor where German bombs were falling, the system that flew Marlene Dietrich into a frozen forest to sing for men who might not survive the week, the system that gave ice cream to German prisoners, while the German private 100 miles away was being told to conquer his hunger with willpower, that system was already doing its work. It was building the resilience that the German system was consuming. Will and spirit conquer material and mass, the Germans said. The Americans answered with something different. They answered with a woman standing on a stage built from ammunition crates, singing a love song to 400 men, because those men were worth more to their country than the risk of losing her. That was the calculation the German system could not perform. Not because the math was difficult, but because the values it required were ones the German system had spent a decade teaching itself not to have. The final truth of this story is not that the American way was perfect. It was not. The segregation that put Lena Horn's audience behind German prisoners proved that. The contradiction between the citizen-soldier ideal and the reality of racial discrimination was real and painful and would take decades more to begin to resolve. But even in its imperfection, the American system contained something the German system did not. It contained the possibility of self-correction. Horn could walk off a stage and sing for the men who deserved it. She could defy the system because the system's own principles demanded the defiance. The German system had no such mechanism. A German Lal Anderson could be banned for knowing Jewish people. A German soldier could love a song his government hated and have no recourse when it was taken away. The system did not serve the soldier. The soldier served the system. And by the winter of 1944, the system was all that was left. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe for the next chapter. There are many of these stories left to tell. Most of them are about ordinary people who walked into extraordinary situations because they believed the men fighting deserved more than orders and ammunition. They deserved to be reminded that they were human, and that someone, somewhere, thought they were worth the trip.